Hello, weary traveller. Tonight, we journey back to a time when life was raw, immediate, and often profoundly uncomfortable. We'll delve into the unexpected realities of what weddings were truly like in medieval times, and then shift our gaze to the ancient world, exploring the surprising customs of the Greek symposium. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you settle deeper into your pillow, let your breath grow slow and steady, imagining the vast stretch of time that separates you from the worlds we are about to explore. Just breathe and let the gentle current of history carry you into a different age. Chapter 1. The Rustic Invitations and Raw Attire. Forget what romantic comedies or lavish historical dramas have sold you about medieval weddings. There were no gilded invitations, no wax seals pressed with a family crest, not even a raven dropping scrolls on rooftops to announce the impending nuptials. In the medieval village, news of a wedding traveled by one method and one method only: gossip. It was the original social media, fueled by whispers at the well, spread by the baker, amplified by the miller, and broadcast to literally everyone by the midwife, whether they cared or not. By nightfall, even the sheep, grazing lazily in their pens, seemed to know that someone was getting married. And the priest, he was, notably, always the last to find out, a quaint detail that tells you much about the formal structure of these affairs. There was simply no such thing as being uninvited. If you were alive, had two legs, and were within walking distance, you went. It wasn't because you felt a particularly deep connection to Thomas or Beatrix, the young couple embarking on their shared life of toil. No, you went because weddings meant food and drink, and perhaps if the spirits were particularly high and the ale flowed freely, a good old-fashioned fistfight. The bride and groom didn't draw up guest lists. They had absolutely no control over who showed up. You might end up with a small gathering of 10 people, or you might find half the county descending upon your humble abode, a churning mass of humanity, livestock, and questionable hygiene. That was just how it worked. More people meant more gifts, and in the harsh, unforgiving economics of peasant life, that translated to the very real possibility of receiving an extra chicken or a sack of turnips, incredibly valuable commodities when your daily diet consisted primarily of gruel and hope. Of course, this meant you had to plan for guests showing up, but also for guests not showing up. Some might be dead, swept away by the latest plague or a sudden fever. Some might be too drunk from the night before, still passed out in a ditch somewhere. And some, bless their simple hearts, might just forget entirely. We hear whispers of one poor soul still harvesting barley, who apparently didn't even notice the entire wedding happened without him. Because, let's be clear, time was a fluid concept. Noon could mean anywhere between breakfast and sunset. There were no watches, just the sun's vague progress across the sky, and people's even vaguer ability to guess how far it had moved since they last looked up from milking a cow or mending a fence. The bride and groom certainly weren't fussed about seating charts or delicate name cards. You sat wherever your weary behind found a landing spot, be it a rough-hewn log, a surprisingly smooth stone, or a convenient haystack. And if a pig had already claimed your chosen perch, well, too bad. The pig stayed. You found another spot. In the medieval peasant world, formal wear was less of a standard and more of a gentle, aspirational suggestion. Fashion, in this context, wasn't about trends or elegance, it was about not being naked, and perhaps, if you were feeling particularly ambitious, brushing the straw out of your hair. The bride, on her momentous day, did her absolute best. She wore her nicest dress, which, to be fair, was almost certainly not white. White fabric was an impractical nightmare, ludicrously expensive, and a magnet for every farm animal, every speck of mud, and every stray bit of manure within a 2-meter radius. Instead, she likely wore brown or grey, or perhaps an off-grey that had once, perhaps 3 harvests ago, been white before a particularly unfortunate sheep-related incident befell it. She might weave a simple crown from wild spring flowers, if the season allowed, or adorn her hair with ribbons fashioned from something vaguely decorative, like an old curtain or someone's spare belt. She didn't expect to look like a queen. She just hoped to look like someone who hadn't been digging onions out of the earth all morning. The goal was simply to appear presentable, clean enough not to offend the nose, and free of any obvious stains that might lead to immediate gossip. The groom, meanwhile, embarked on his own quest for respectability. He might, if he was truly committed to the occasion, wash his tunic. He might even attempt to comb his hair, assuming, of course, that he still possessed some. If he was lucky enough to own shoes, they went on his feet. If not, barefoot it was. Calloused feet were not considered rude or unkempt. They were seen as rustic, a sign of honest labour, a badge of a working man. And if he smelled vaguely like pig, well, so did literally everyone else. Hygiene, as a concept, was relative at best. Soap existed, yes, but not the kind you'd want anywhere near your eyes, unless you enjoyed a searing chemical burn. Bathing was done seasonally, when the weather permitted a plunge into a cold stream, or simply when it rained heavily to act as a communal shower. So most guests didn't arrive sparkling clean and smelling of lavender. They arrived recognizably human, which, by medieval standards, was more than enough. Accessories were exceedingly rare, but when they appeared, they were deeply meaningful. A belt with an extra pouch? Stylish. A hat with a single battered feather? Bold. A tooth still firmly in place within your mouth? That was the ultimate luxury. No one owned jewelry unless it had been cunningly stolen or miraculously passed down from a great-grandmother who had once, long ago, possibly kissed a merchant. Children arrived smeared in mud, proudly displaying whatever unfortunate insect or interesting twig they'd found on their journey to the festivities. Old men wore the same rough wool cloak they wore every single day, its fibers stiff with dirt and age. Old women, wrapped in layers of worn fabric, cast judgmental glances at everyone, muttering ancient complaints like, "When I got married," under their breath. But here's the crucial point. No one truly cared if your hem was frayed, or if your sleeves didn't quite match, or if your tunic had seen better decades. This wasn't a fashion show designed for social climbing. This was a rare, precious break from the relentless grind of labor, a communal moment of shared joy, a chance to simply exist outside the endless cycle of survival. And if you arrived with both your boots and most of your teeth, you were practically nobility in your own right, ready to participate in the rustic spectacle that was a medieval peasant wedding. The quiet joy of the day transcended outward appearances, finding its true beauty in the collective relief from the harshness of everyday existence. Chapter 2. The Muddy Altar and the Communal Cauldron. The wedding venue for the humble medieval peasant was dictated by simple necessity. wherever there was space, and ideally fewer than 5 pigs. Ideally, the ceremony took place in the churchyard, but never ever inside the church itself. That sacred space was strictly reserved for noble weddings, for grand ceremonies of the elite, and for high-maintenance saints. Peasants made do with what they had, which often meant exchanging sacred vows next to a freshly dug grave, under the ancient boughs of a gnarled oak tree, or, in a truly bizarre twist, beside a chicken coop that, for the day, conveniently doubled as a makeshift bandstand. Grass was considered a luxury, a soft carpet reserved for the privileged. Most of the time, the ground was either parched and cracked, baked hard by the relentless summer sun, or, far more often, soggy and riddled with surprise holes, waiting to trap an unwary foot. If it had rained recently, which, given the unpredictability of medieval weather, it usually had, the entire ceremony took place on a patch of churned-up mud, generously seasoned with the unmistakable aroma of manure. Guests arrived wearing their wedding boots, which were, of course, just their regular boots, but with a new, resigned expression etched onto their faces. There were no comfortable chairs, no festive bunting, no grand altar crafted from reclaimed oak. People stood, or squatted on their haunches, or leaned precariously against fences that creaked ominously with every shift in weight. Sometimes a kind soul would drag a crude wooden bench to the spot, and the village elders would immediately claim it, settling in like royalty without a throne, surveying the scene with a mixture of wisdom and wary amusement. Everyone else just tried not to fall into a ditch, a surprisingly common challenge amidst the celebratory chaos. The decorations, such as they were, consisted primarily of nature itself, mostly weeds. If someone, driven by a flicker of Martha Stewart-level ambition, managed to hang a few wild flowers or brightly coloured ribbons around a fence post, it was considered a grand gesture, a lavish display of decorative prowess. The rest of the setting was filled in by animals. Mangy dogs sniffing everything with boundless curiosity, chickens absolutely underfoot, constantly in the way, and the occasional confused goat photobombing the betrothal, its bleating adding an unexpected counterpoint to the sacred vows. And then there were the smells, the distinct earthy scent of animals in nearby fields, and the faint but persistent whiff of cabbage stew simmering in someone's communal pot. Combined with the vibrant atmosphere of the gathering, the lively sounds of conversation, and the true spirit of lives lived close to the land, it was less a wedding ambiance and more a medieval tapestry of farm and festivity. But still, people showed up, because the setting didn't matter. This was a rare, precious break from the soul-crushing grind of survival. The wedding could have been held in a humble, simple spot, even a muddy patch by a field's edge, and it would still have been infinitely better than weeding barley all day, every day. By the time the bride and groom stood before the priest, most of the guests were already feeling the effects of the day, perhaps a little sunburned, or 3 cups of ale deep into the celebration, which was perfectly fine, because the ceremony itself wasn't exactly a Shakespearean affair. It was short, it was awkward, and if the priest had somewhere else to be afterward, like, say, helping to dig a grave or yelling at a particularly stubborn goose, for the church had range, it was even shorter. For medieval peasants, marriage wasn't about delicate flowers, gleaming rings, or tearful, heartfelt vows. It was mostly about contractual clarity, a practical arrangement for shared labour and mutual survival. The Church, by the 12th century, had begun to insist on a priest's involvement, lending an air of holy legitimacy to the union. But truth be told, many couples considered themselves truly married the moment they declared their consent in front of witnesses. I take you as mine, and you take me as yours. That was the gist of it. romantic in a highly practical, tax-liable sort of way. Some ceremonies might include a brief blessing, a few mumbled Latin phrases. Most didn't involve kissing, not out of modesty, but because no one was particularly eager to put their mouth on someone else's mouth after 6 days without soap and an intimate acquaintance with farm animals. The priest might cross himself, say a quick prayer, and then rush off to his next urgent task. There were no rings, unless someone had managed to find a bent copper trinket or had inherited a questionable family heirloom, perhaps a tarnished bit of metal that had seen better centuries. Some couples exchanged small tokens, a scrap of cloth, a blunt knife, or a single precious coin to seal the deal. Others simply shook hands, a firm, calloused grip, and hoped no one backed out before sundown. Consent was the absolute key. Both parties had to agree, out loud, and crucially, in front of others. If the bride remained silent, looking like she might bolt at any moment, the priest was technically supposed to delay things. But often a stern, meaningful glance from a parent or a pointed reminder of dowries already exchanged moved things along with surprising speed. And that truly was it. No soaring organ music, no delicate flower petals raining down, no long rambling speeches filled with platitudes. Just two peasants standing in a muddy yard, saying a simple yes to a future of shared labour, the inevitable arrival of screaming children, and, if they were truly exceptionally lucky, one good thick blanket to share through the long cold nights. But despite this stark simplicity, the weight of the moment was undeniably real. In that fleeting instant, surrounded by their friends, their noisy livestock, and a handful of curiosity-driven toddlers, they were bound, not by lace or the scent of incense, but by simple, powerful words. And in the medieval world, words had a potent, tangible power, especially when they were immediately followed by copious amounts of ale. Now, when medieval peasants said feast, what they truly meant was, we have more than one kind of food today, and nobody has to steal it to get it. The post-wedding meal wasn't a catered affair. There was no meticulously designed menu. There were no servers politely circulating with trays of delicacies. There was, however, a single massive communal pot that had been bubbling over a fire for hours, containing roughly half the village's collective hopes and literally all of its root vegetables. The undisputed centerpiece of this momentous meal was usually a thick, unctuous stew, bubbling contentedly in a cauldron the size of a small cart. Into this culinary abyss went cabbage, leeks, onions, barley, turnips, maybe some dried peas, and if the gods of generosity or recklessness were smiling upon you, a meagre bit of meat, perhaps a scrawny chicken if someone had been feeling particularly magnanimous. Otherwise, the flavor was left entirely in the hands of salt, or more likely, fate itself. Guests didn't sit at tables. They found a convenient rock, a sturdy fallen log, a rough-hewn bench, or, in a pinch, simply leaned against a sturdy, patient dog. Bowls were passed around, usually crudely carved wooden affairs, and if you hadn't had the foresight to bring your own, you either had to eat directly from your hands or brave the uncertain social waters of borrowing your neighbor's. Spoons were wooden, often shared, or in many cases entirely theoretical. Fingers did most of the essential work. The drinks, mercifully, were better. Ale was plentiful, home-brewed, and often far stronger than you expected. It went down fast, burned slightly as it coursed through you, and possessed the magical ability to make even burnt stew taste like pure, unadulterated joy. Water was technically an option, but most people wisely avoided it, as it often doubled as a bacteria cocktail, teeming with unseen dangers. Ale, on the other hand, was safer and infinitely more festive. Bread, when it was available, was dense enough to stun a pig. It was either fresh and wonderfully sour from its fermentation, or old and sharp enough to qualify as a blunt weapon. Cheese made occasional appearances, but only if the cow had been particularly kind that week, producing an abundance of milk. There were no desserts to speak of, unless someone had managed to gather a handful of wild berries or dried fruit, and no one, you quickly learned, truly trusted the berries. Still, by the austere standards of peasant life, this was abundance. A second bowl, a third, that was luxury beyond imagining. Children raced around with crusts of bread clutched tightly in their sticky hands. Elders gnawed contentedly, their gums performing valiant work. Dogs wandered underfoot, receiving more scraps of food than usual and far less appreciation than they truly deserved. And despite the utter lack of silver platters, fancy cuts of meat, or elaborate presentations, the feast meant something profound. It was a chance to be truly full, to momentarily rest from the endless grind, to celebrate something, anything, other than simply surviving the brutal winter or the relentless demands of the harvest. Because when you live a life ruled by unpredictable seasons, by the unforgiving plough, and by the terrifying spectre of random plague outbreaks, any excuse to eat together, to laugh loudly, and to forget your troubles, even for a few precious hours, is a victory, even if it tasted mostly like boiled cabbage. Chapter 3. The Practical Gifts and Wild Child Revelry. Forget the notion of blenders, monogrammed towels, or sleek kitchen appliances. In a medieval peasant wedding, the gift registry was magnificently simple. Bring whatever you can physically carry, and preferably it should be either alive or edible. Wedding gifts weren't about sentiment, about delicate expressions of love or shared dreams. They were about raw, unvarnished survival. Guests arrived bearing whatever meagre possessions they had to spare. A couple of fresh eggs, carefully cradled in a basket. A sturdy chunk of hard cheese, wrapped in a cloth. A live chicken, its legs tied together, squawking indignantly on the way to its new home. Or, in truly rare and supremely generous cases, a small sack of precious grain. These weren't gifts in the modern sense. They were practical investments in the couple's new life together, tangible contributions to their struggle for existence. Because, let's be honest, nothing quite says congratulations on your lifelong binding contract of shared poverty and relentless labor like half a dozen earthy turnips. Occasionally someone would arrive with something a bit more interpretive. An old hoe, its handle long since missing, but perhaps still useful for some obscure task. A wooden spoon bearing distinct bite marks from a previous owner, perhaps a hungry child or a gnawing rat. Or, in a particularly memorable instance, a goat with a limp and questionable eyesight, its bleating adding to the general cacophony. But even these eccentric offerings were better than arriving empty-handed. Showing up without a gift, however humble, marked you as either very, very poor, a fact everyone knew anyway, or astonishingly bold, a defiance of communal expectation. And either way, people noticed. Whispers would follow you, a low hum of judgment that could linger for weeks. Money, as a form of gift, was virtually unheard of. Most peasants rarely saw coins, and when they did, they tended to hoard them like dragons hoard gold, secreted away for dire emergencies or the impossible dream of escaping their lot. So the very idea of giving money as a wedding gift was laughable, an alien concept. Goods, not coins, made the world go round. If someone managed to give the bride a jug of freshly brewed ale or a warm, dense loaf of bread, they were practically royalty in the eyes of the community. Sometimes gifts were recycled, and yes, that's as medieval as it gets, a testament to the brutal practicality of their lives. A goose given with much fanfare at your wedding might mysteriously reappear at your cousin's wedding a year later, slightly older, undoubtedly angrier, but still a valuable contribution. There were even persistent whispers of one particular clay jug, chipped and worn, that had purportedly been making the rounds for over a decade, passed from one wedding to the next. No one remembered where it had come from, and no one dared to keep it permanently, lest they break the unwritten cycle of communal gifting. But the gifts weren't just for the newly married couple. They also played a subtle but significant role in community optics. Giving something genuinely useful proved you were invested in the household's success, a loyal member of the village fabric. It signaled goodwill, participation, and perhaps a silent, unspoken hope that when it was your turn to marry, someone would return the favor with a particularly plump chicken. And despite the randomness of the gifts, despite the open secret of regifting, there was a quiet warmth in it all. These weren't luxurious things, no silk or jewels, but they were what people could truly spare. In a world where most possessed very little, giving anything at all, even a squawking bird that fought you the whole way there, was an act of genuine generosity, a testament to the enduring spirit of community in the face of hardship. If you've ever been to a wedding where no one, absolutely no one, hired a babysitter, now imagine that scene. But add more mud, fewer teeth, and absolutely zero supervision. That, my friend, was a medieval peasant wedding. Children were everywhere, not politely sitting, not carefully nibbling bread crusts, certainly not engaging in quiet, structured play. No, they were tearing through the gathering like a horde of feral squirrels on a sugar high, fueled by stolen bread crusts and pure, unadulterated chaos. And crucially, no one stopped them. Not because the adults didn't care, but because they were far too busy eating, drinking, and skillfully avoiding eye contact with their in-laws. In the complete absence of structured play, or indeed any toys beyond a stick or a rock, kids got incredibly creative. They raced sticks down muddy puddles, threw surprisingly accurate mud balls at unsuspecting chickens, and dared each other to touch the priest's grumpy donkey. They used turnips as makeshift projectiles and haystacks as wonderfully bouncy, if slightly scratchy, crash mats. At least one child, in every wedding, always ended up perilously close to the communal stew pot, thankfully not in it, but close enough to raise serious questions about the stew's final ingredients. Toddlers toddled directly into the middle of the ceremony, oblivious to the sacred vows. Babies were either strapped securely to hips, or more often simply plopped onto the ground like satchels, left to discover the wonders of mud and errant chicken droppings. A child would cry, reliably, every 5 minutes, either because they had tripped over a root, were bitten by another child, or had their only snack stolen by a passing opportunistic dog. No one panicked. This was, after all, completely normal. The bride and groom often ignored the madness, their focus elsewhere. Occasionally, the bride, mid-vow, would instinctively grab a toddler by the scruff of its collar and hand it off to someone else with a terse, "Here, yours now." The child, utterly unfazed, would simply scurry off like a tiny medieval gremlin, ready for the next adventure. Sometimes there was a self-appointed group of older kids who, with all the compassion of tiny landlords, lorded over the younger ones. "No, you can't sit there. Yes, we're allowed to take your bread." It was Lord of the Flies meets dirt and truly questionable hygiene. In truth, weddings were some of the only times children were allowed, even tacitly encouraged, to be completely wild. It was understood. Let them burn off their boundless steam while the adults did the same, albeit with more ale and less mud. If they didn't come back at the end of the day, covered in scratches, bruises, and someone else's breadcrumbs, were they even truly at a wedding? By the time the festivities wound down, most children were passed out in hay piles, sticky, exhausted, and remarkably content. A few had acquired minor injuries, a scraped knee or a bumped head, but no one was surprised, and certainly no one was overly concerned. This was just part of the grand, chaotic tradition of medieval peasant life. Chapter 4. The Off-Key Serenades and Staggering Revelry. In the grand tradition of medieval peasant weddings, music was less an organized performance and more whatever sound someone could coax out of an object, usually with more enthusiasm than skill. If you were lucky, truly miraculously lucky, a local with a battered fiddle might show up. And if you were very, very lucky, he knew more than one tune. The most common musician, however, was that one guy. Every village had him. He was the one who claimed he could play something. A rickety flute, a wobbly pipe, or a badly tuned lute with only 3 strings and one very ambitious dream. Sometimes the instrument was entirely improvised.
A pot lid and a stick, 2 empty jugs clanking together, or just enthusiastic, tuneless whistling through missing teeth. If no one, absolutely no one, brought an actual instrument, well, congratulations! You now had a choir of ale-soaked uncles belting out the one wedding song they all vaguely remembered. The lyrics, if they existed beyond a few repeated phrases, were vague, slightly inappropriate, and repeated relentlessly until someone passed out or simply forgot the words, whichever came first. Drums, when they were present, were anything that made a satisfying noise when struck. Buckets, empty barrels, overturned pots. On one memorable occasion, rumor had it, a well-fed goose inside a sack. Rhythmic stomping was also a perennial favorite, particularly useful since it served a dual purpose. It doubled as dancing and, quite effectively, scared away rats. The repertoire of songs was incredibly narrow. Most tunes fell into one of 3 distinct categories. Love songs, where someone, usually the maiden, definitely died at the end. Drinking songs, where everyone, invariably, died at the end. Or historical ballads, where everyone died and, as a cruel twist of fate, also lost their sheep. No one really cared about skill or virtuosity. Volume mattered far more than melody. If you were loud and enthusiastic, you were a musician. If you possessed even a shred of rhythm, you were considered a professional. And if you could clap in time and manage not to fall over, you were an absolute legend, a virtuoso of the highest order. Children often joined in, adding their high-pitched screeches to the already raucous mix. Dogs, sensing the chaos and the potential for dropped food, barked along with surprising enthusiasm. Occasionally, a rooster, mistaking the general din for dawn, would try to solo, its crowing adding another layer of bizarre charm. It was, in a word, chaos. And yet, somehow, despite all logic and reason, it worked.
The soundscape was clumsy, off-key, occasionally alarming, but it filled the air with joy, or at least with noise, and that, for the weary souls of the medieval village, was more than enough. For peasants who rarely heard music beyond a church bell, the mournful lowing of cattle, or the relentless sound of rain on a leaking roof, this was magic. Brief, messy, and utterly unforgettable magic. Once the music started, And by music we mean rhythmic banging and someone whistling wildly off-key. It was only a matter of time before the dancing began. And by dancing we absolutely do not mean elegant waltzes or refined courtly steps. We mean stomping, flailing, and vaguely coordinated hopping, performed with the unbridled energy of people who had spent the last 6 months bent double in a barley field. There were no formal dances in peasant villages, no rehearsed routines passed down through generations. What you had was instinctual celebration, deeply chaotic but undeniably sincere. People formed circles, or lines, or something vaguely resembling both, and simply moved. There might be clapping, enthusiastic slapping of backs, hearty shouting, and vigorous stomping, often all at the same time, and rarely, if ever, in rhythm. Feet pounded the earth with enough force to startle birds from nearby trees and churn up the already muddy ground into a thick celebratory mire. Arms were thrown around shoulders, backs were slapped, sometimes accidentally, sometimes with surprising force. The village elders clapped along from the sidelines, cheering on anyone who managed to stay upright for longer than 3 consecutive songs. Some villagers, those brave souls who had perhaps visited larger towns or heard improbable tales from a travelling dancer who once passed through 5 years ago, attempted fancier steps. These bold individuals would try a graceful spin or an ambitious leap, only to land awkwardly in the mud and quickly pretend they had meant to sit down anyway. Shoes were entirely optional. By the second dance, most people had either kicked them off, lost them entirely in the deepening mud, or discovered that they were simply slowing them down. Bare feet slapping against the muddy earth became the impromptu percussion section, adding to the primal rhythm of the celebration. Occasionally someone would fall. Everyone would cheer, because falling, it was understood, was simply part of the ritual, a sign of true commitment to the joyous abandon of the moment. The bride and groom were, of course, expected to participate. The crowd would chant their names, shout encouragement, and sometimes, with surprising force, physically shove them into the middle of the dancing circle. They danced while blushing, laughing, or silently begging for someone, anyone, to steal the spotlight. Children joined in too, inventing their own moves, which mostly involved spinning until they fell over. One particularly bold child often initiated a conga line, though no one ever knew where they had learned it. They just did. And while no one would ever call it graceful, the dancing was undeniably honest. It was joyful. It was peasants saying, "We're alive, we're fed, we're together, let's move." If music was optional and dancing was improvised, ale was absolutely, unequivocally mandatory. No medieval peasant wedding was complete without it. And not just a pint or two. We're talking jugs, barrels, buckets, and anything else that could hold a fermented liquid without leaking too fast. Water, as we've discussed, was considered deeply suspicious, mostly because it tended to contain unpleasant things like frogs, floating filth, or the dreaded dysentery. Ale, on the other hand, had been boiled during its brewing process, which made it infinitely safer and far, far more entertaining. It wasn't always strong, but it certainly could be, depending on who brew it and how little they valued subtlety. Most weddings featured a mix of weak ale, suitable for children and the elderly, and something considerably stronger, which could drop a grown man in 3 cups flat. The latter was often stored in large wooden casks and ladled out like a thick soup. You didn't ask what was in it, you just drank it and hoped you remembered the rest of the evening. Mugs were passed around freely. If you had your own, great. If not, you simply shared. No one worried about germs.
mostly because the concept of germs hadn't been invented yet, and also because the ale, with its tingling burn, felt incredibly clean. That tingly burning sensation, they often joked, was the sanitizing effect, or possibly impending blindness. With each round, the crowd grew louder, looser, and a bit more chaotic. Polite laughter gave way to booming belly laughs. Stories became more exaggerated, stretching the truth with each gulp. People started complimenting the bride's dazzling smile or the groom's oddly shaped knees. Someone always started a drinking song, which quickly turned into a shouting contest, which then inevitably turned into a peaceful nap under the nearest table. There was always one person who shouldn't have had that last cup. The kind of person who began the evening by singing lustily and ended it by discreetly vomiting behind a haystack. And yet no one judged. That was just part of the ritual, an accepted part of the boisterous celebration. In a world of hard labor, harsh winters, and the looming shadow of mortality, ale was more than just a beverage. It was social glue. It made people talk, laugh, confess their deepest secrets, and occasionally fall into a trough. And at a wedding, it served one essential, undeniable purpose: to turn a sacred union into a party no one would remember clearly, but everyone would remember fondly. No medieval peasant wedding was complete without a touch of unpredictable chaos. Not necessarily planned chaos, but the kind that simmers just under the surface until someone's elbow nudges the wrong jug of ale, or someone else flirts just a little too brazenly with the wrong cousin. Let's start with the flirtations. Weddings were absolute matchmaking gold mines, a rare opportunity for social mingling. You had music, you had drink, you had food, technically, and you had a field full of eligible peasants who had spent the past several months covered in mud and battling existential despair. A wedding offered the rare, precious chance to see someone without soot on their face, without the grime of daily labor obscuring their features. It was basically medieval speed dating, but with far higher stakes and far less privacy. Glances were exchanged. Wildflowers were awkwardly offered. A few brave souls attempted poetry, which usually involved rhyming hay with May and quickly losing their nerve. The dance floor, muddy as it was prime flirting territory, though most moves involved tripping into someone and then pretending it was a romantic sweeping gesture. Of course, not all flirtations were welcome, and that, inevitably, is where the fights began. The most common triggers: someone danced too closely with someone else's intended, someone spilled precious ale on a borrowed tunic, or, a classic, someone insulted someone's goat, a deeply personal offense. Again, the fights were rarely serious, mostly involving shoving, slurred shouting, and the occasional wrestling match in the mud that no one actually tried to break up. By the time it ended, both parties were usually too tired or too drunk to remember what they were arguing about in the first place. They'd shake hands, share a mug of ale, and move on, their brief burst of aggression forgotten in the haze of celebration. Then there were the accidents. Weddings, plus livestock, plus copious amounts of ale, equaled predictably unpredictable results. Chickens were frequently stepped on. Children, as we've established, fell into barrels. Someone always tripped into the stew pot. Once, legend has it, a goat got hopelessly tangled in the bride's veil and dragged her 10 feet through the mud before anyone even noticed. She was fine. The goat was applauded for its unexpected contribution to the entertainment. But no one was surprised. Accidents were simply part of the fun. They gave the villagers stories to tell for years to come. Remember Thomas's wedding, when old Magda sat on the beehive? Instant legend, passed down through generations.
And while nobles had pristine banquets and carefully rehearsed toasts, peasants had spilled ale, accidental kisses, and mild head injuries. And somehow that felt far more genuine, a truer reflection of life itself. At some point in every medieval peasant wedding, right after the fourth slurred drinking song, but just before the goat inevitably stole the bread, someone would look around with a slightly confused gaze and ask the question, "Hey, where'd the bride and groom go?" Cue the knowing smirks from the older men, the raised eyebrows from the gossiping women, the older aunties nudging each other and muttering things like, "Well, they didn't waste time, did they?" Because everyone knew exactly where the newlyweds were, or at least what they were doing. Consummation wasn't just tradition, it was, crucially, legally important. In medieval Christian Europe, a marriage wasn't considered fully valid until it was, let's say, made official in the eyes of the Lord and, more tangibly, a sagging straw mattress. Technically, some weddings even had witnesses, a rather disturbing mix of custom and sheer nosiness, though by the later Middle Ages most villages wisely abandoned that particular part of the ritual. The newlyweds usually slipped away to a barn or a back room or perhaps a hovel that someone had, with great effort, swept out for the occasion. Privacy, of course, was relative. There were no locks, and curtains were a luxury beyond imagination. But the important thing was the symbolic disappearance, the removal of themselves from the communal gaze. The community understood. Let them vanish. Let them bond. Meanwhile, back at the feast, the party carried on with unflagging enthusiasm. The absence of the couple didn't stop the dancing, or the ale, or the increasingly off-key singing. If anything, it simply gave people something new and juicy to gossip about. How long do you think they'll be gone? Betty trips over his own boots, you know, but she looked like she knew what she was doing. Well, his mother did say he's clumsy, didn't she? When the couple eventually reappeared, hours later, flushed, rumpled, and vaguely victorious, no one said anything out loud, but everyone looked. The groom received hearty handshakes and knowing winks. The bride received proud nods and a torrent of unsolicited advice from women who had been married since the great turnip shortage of 1314. Some couples, it was whispered, didn't return at all on the wedding night. They simply fell asleep in the hay, exhausted but content, or decided that right now, in the quiet aftermath of the chaotic celebration, was a perfectly good time to start that domestic bliss early. No one blamed them. After months of grueling labor and years of patient waiting, they had certainly earned their brief, precious escape from the noise, the mud, and the neighbors who simply couldn't stop commenting. And while there were no honeymoons in the modern sense, that stolen hour or two of privacy was the closest thing they would ever get to a romantic escape. The morning after a medieval peasant wedding was less about romantic sunrises and more about a brutal hangover with livestock. Gone were the sounds of music and raucous laughter, the frantic, joyful chasing of goats. In their place remained aching feet, empty jugs, and the slow communal realization that someone had definitely, unquestionably, slept in a cabbage patch. Guests emerged, blinking from wherever they had collapsed. Haystacks, under carts, inside sheds, or simply curled up next to the communal fire like large snoring cats. Hair was matted, tunics were muddy. One man was suspiciously wearing someone else's cloak and didn't seem particularly eager to give it back. The feast table, if you could even call it that, was now a desolate war zone. Half-eaten loaves of bread, sticky spills of ale, an overturned stew pot, and the unmistakable, lingering presence of a chicken that had clearly spent the entire night there. Someone, amid the wreckage, found a single, solitary shoe in a tree. Someone else had, inexplicably, acquired a new dog. Children, of course, were already up, wide awake and sticky, dragging sticks and singing fragments of the wedding song with lyrics they'd invented on the spot. One toddler walked past proudly holding a goose egg, and no one knew where he had got it or if the goose was okay. The bride and groom were likely still hiding, savoring their last moments of quiet. They'd resurface eventually, disheveled, exhausted, and probably with straw in their hair, ready to begin a new life of shared chores, relentless livestock maintenance, and a mild, constant existential dread. But on this morning, they were allowed to remain mythical figures, a lingering mystery. Those with stronger stomachs, the truly resilient, helped with the daunting task of cleaning. Bread crusts were salvaged, carefully brushed off, and deemed still edible. Mugs were stacked, barrels rolled away. Others simply sat on logs, holding their aching heads and muttering desperate prayers for silence, for a strong cup of tea, or for the impossible magic of time travel. The priest walked by, looking suspiciously smug. He hadn't parted. He remembered everything. And worse, he was ready to talk about it. Yet, despite the pervasive mess, the lingering smells, the general discomfort, no one truly complained. There was a quiet satisfaction in the aftermath. The wedding had happened. The couple was married. The village had come together, danced, eaten, bled a little, and survived. And that, in the harsh reality of the medieval world, was more than enough. When you picture a medieval wedding, it's tempting, isn't it, to imagine elegance, flower garlands, flowing gowns, sweet, soaring music wafting through ancient trees. And that, perhaps, might have happened somewhere, in some noble court for a fleeting moment. But for the vast majority of peasants, the real, enduring legacy of a wedding was much simpler and far more tangible. It was mud, it was raucous laughter, it was bruised knees, it was the unforgettable taste of boiled cabbage, and above all, it was community. These weddings weren't about prestige. They weren't elaborate spectacles meticulously designed to impress foreign dignitaries or rival families. There were no photographers to capture every moment, no professional planners to fret over every detail, no mood boards to dictate the ambience. What there was, and what truly mattered, was presence. The entire village came out, not just to witness the vows, but to actively participate in something rare, something precious, joy. Because medieval life for peasants wasn't just hard. It was relentlessly, unforgivingly hard. Hunger, disease, crippling taxes, brutally bad weather, and the occasional armed noble crashing through your barley field, destroying weeks of labor in a single careless gallop. Joy was brief, fun was fleeting, but weddings were the glorious exception, a communal pause in the unending chaos, a sacred moment where dirt-stained hands held precious bread instead of tools, and weary voices sang lustily instead of swearing at stubborn rocks. Even if the stew was bland, even if the ale ran out too soon, even if someone got kicked by a donkey, it didn't matter. What mattered was that the village had gathered to say, in their own chaotic, beautiful way, "These two people now face the world together. Let's all shout and spill things in their honor." And so, the legacy of the peasant wedding wasn't captured in stained glass or chronicled in illuminated manuscripts. It lived on in stories told around crackling bread fires, in the fragments of song hummed during the next grueling harvest, in the quiet, shared smile between a couple months later, now with more calloused hands and a deeper shared debt.
It was in the mud-strewn memories, the goose-related injuries, the whispered gossip that somehow became legend. It was real, it was messy, and it belonged truly to the people. And if the world ended tomorrow, as it occasionally tried to do in the Middle Ages, the villagers would at least have this memory: a day when life felt lighter, when no one worked, and when two people said yes to each other while chickens clucked disapprovingly nearby. Chapter 5. The Rules of the Krater and the Unveiling of Love. Before the wine was poured, before the lyre was plucked, there were rules, lots of them. Despite the chaos and laughter that might erupt later in the night, the Greek symposium was not some mindless frat party. It was a highly ritualized, exclusive gathering, and in many ways strangely sacred. You didn't just show up and start drinking as if it were a common tavern. No, that would have been utterly barbaric in the eyes of any self-respecting Greek aristocrat. First, you had to be invited. The host, known as the symposiarch, carefully curated the guest list, selecting individuals not just for their social standing, but for their wit, their intellect, and their potential to contribute to stimulating conversation. This was invariably an all-male affair, freeborn men only. Slaves? They served, moving silently through the room, replenishing cups and removing soiled dishes. Women? Only courtesans, specifically the highly educated Hetairai, were allowed inside. Wives, the respectable women of the household, stayed behind closed doors, hidden from the intellectual and sensual world unfolding in the andron. The evening began not with wine, but with a formal meal, the darpanon. Everyone would eat, reclining elegantly on couches, their heads propped up on plush cushions, looking like relaxed philosophers already deep in thought. This meal was merely the warm-up, the overture to the main event. No alcohol yet. That came after. Because once the food was cleared away, once the floor was swept clean of crumbs and stray leaves, the real event, the symposium proper, began. The wine was mixed with water in a large, ornate vessel called a Krater, which sat prominently in the center of the room. To drink wine unmixed, undiluted, as the Scythians or other barbarians did, was considered utterly uncivilized, a sign of lack of self-control and refinement. The symposiarch, the elected master of ceremonies for the evening, held immense power, for he decided the crucial wine-to-water ratio. A weak mix signaled a night of earnest conversation and lofty discourse. A strong mix? That hinted at a descent into glorious Dionysian chaos. It was a fine line to tread, a delicate balance. Too stiff, and things remained rigid, formal, uninspired. Too drunk, and Plato's dialogues quickly devolved into a Dionysian disaster of slurred words and physical mishaps. Now here's where it truly gets interesting. Every symposium, regardless of its ultimate trajectory, had an underlying purpose. It might be philosophical, a deep dive into the nature of justice or beauty. It might be political, a clandestine strategy session disguised as a jovial gathering. Or it might be poetic, a night dedicated to composing impromptu verses and reciting Homer. But underlying all of that was a profound sense of sacred leisure, what the Greeks called skolola. This wasn't wasted time, mere idleness. It was where ideas were born, where young aristocrats sharpened their minds, where verbal games were played, where impromptu poetry was composed, and where, just perhaps, they fell deeply, passionately in love. Before the debates officially started, before the first drop of mixed wine touched their lips, libations were poured to Dionysus, the god of wine and divine madness, acknowledging his influence over the proceedings. There was singing, sometimes by hired musicians, skilled lyre players or flute girls, sometimes by the guests themselves, their voices growing louder and more confident with each passing cup. A flute girl might play a haunting melody. A courtesan might challenge a guest to a riddle, her eyes sparkling with wit. But everything was structured, part of an unspoken ritual. The wine passed clockwise, a steady, measured flow. Each round came with a toast, a philosophical aphorism, or a clever quip. Drinking too fast was frowned upon, a sign of gluttony. Getting sloppy, losing control of one's faculties, was utterly shameful. The ideal guest was witty, graceful, charming, and just drunk enough to tell the truth beautifully, to speak from the soul without inhibition. In the end, the symposium was a performance, a stage where men proved their intellect as much as their tolerance for wine. It was a delicate dance between reason and indulgence, a controlled descent into intellectual and sensual pleasure. And if you broke the rules, if you lost your composure, you weren't just embarrassing yourself. You were insulting the very spirit of the gathering, betraying the sacred purpose of Skolola. The physical setting of a symposium was no accident. It was meticulously designed, a stage for both mind and body to perform within. The event typically took place in a specially designated room within the Greek household called the andron, a space reserved solely for men. It was usually a square or rectangular room, its walls lined with couches known as klein. Each klein was wide enough for a man to recline comfortably on his side, propped up on one elbow, creating an intimate communal atmosphere. The center of the room was left open, a practical space for servants to pour wine from the Krater, for dancers to perform, or for the occasional impromptu game involving tossing wine dregs at a target. Yes, they had drinking games too, even amidst the most profound philosophical discussions. Light came from flickering oil lamps, casting dancing shadows on the walls, creating an intimate, slightly mysterious ambience. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, the rich aroma of roasted meats from the earlier meal, and the subtle, intoxicating perfumes worn by the Hetairai. It was sensual, designed to lover inhibitions without completely erasing the intellect. The couches were almost always arranged in a circle or a U-shape, specifically to encourage eye contact, to facilitate verbal sparring, and to foster shared laughter. This wasn't just architecture, it was profound psychology. Everyone had, at least spatially, equal status here. No one sat at the head of a table, no one was visually elevated above another. This spatial equality fostered a kind of philosophical democracy, an egalitarian moment in a deeply hierarchical world where ideas could clash and flow freely. The mood of a symposium could shift dramatically, depending on the host's temperament and the specific mix of guests. Some symposia were intensely serious political strategy sessions, disguised as convivial drinking parties. Others devolved into raucous singing contests and, occasionally, spontaneous naked dancing.
And some, like the famous one described in Plato's Symposium, were lofty, abstract, and almost religious in their tone, exploring the highest ideals of love and beauty. But they all began in the same foundational place, with a shared space, a shared drink, and a shared unspoken sense that something important, something transformative was about to happen. Even the decor mattered, whispering subtle messages. Walls were often adorned with mythological paintings, Hercules feasting with the gods, Dionysus leading his drunken revelers, satyrs chasing nymphs through idyllic landscapes. These weren't just pretty images, they were potent reminders of the thin veil between civilization and ecstatic chaos, between the ordered world and the divine frenzy. They whispered, "This is play, yes, but it is sacred play." And let's not forget the wine itself, served in beautifully decorated cups called kyllikes. These cups often had erotic or comic scenes painted at the bottom, slowly revealed as the drinker emptied his cup. The moment of draining your drink came with a laugh, a blush, or a clever comment, depending on who was watching and what image was uncovered. At the heart of many symposia lay a dynamic that continues to baffle and fascinate modern minds: the paiderastia relationship between an older man, the Orestes, and a younger male beloved, the Eromenos. This wasn't just tolerated, in many circles it was idealized, considered a noble pursuit. The older man was typically the teacher, the mentor, the lover, the sponsor of intellect and refinement. The younger man, usually a teenage boy of aristocratic birth, was the student, the object of admiration, and the recipient of wisdom. And the symposium, with its intimate setting and loosened inhibitions, was their designated theatre. This bond wasn't meant to be purely carnal, at least not in theory.
It was supposed to be about virtue, about discipline, about the passing down of knowledge, moral character, and a love for beauty in its highest forms. But that didn't stop the air in the symposium from becoming charged with a palpable erotic tension, a subtle dance of desire and restraint. The older men would use clever wordplay, philosophical arguments, and recited poetry to woo the beautiful youths reclining beside them. Compliments were expected, flowery and heartfelt. Groping, however, was generally frowned upon, considered crude and lacking in refinement. The key was restraint. It proved control, dignity, and the seriousness of one's intellectual and emotional intent. The beloved, meanwhile, was expected to resist, at least publicly. His virtue, his social value, lay in how well he could deflect advances with grace and wit, to show that he was not easily swayed by mere physical desire. A boy who gave in too easily lost social value, appearing cheap or common. A boy who refused everyone forever risked seeming cold or arrogant. The ideal kept everyone guessing, a delicate game of push and pull. He would blush, he would deflect with a witty retort, he would tease with his eyes. And above all, he was expected to listen, to absorb not just affection, but profound wisdom. Now, not every guest engaged in these specific dynamics. Married men were, theoretically, supposed to behave themselves, though, let's be honest, many did not. Courtesans and Hetairai were present, explicitly allowed to offer physical pleasure for a price. But the boys, the Aromani, were meant to offer something higher, something more profound: inspiration. They were the muses of the male elite, their youthful beauty reminding older men of fleeting beauty, of time's cruel advance, of why philosophy mattered in the first place.
Plato famously used a symposium as the setting to explore the very nature of love itself, describing it as a ladder, beginning with physical attraction and rising toward the divine contemplation of the eternal form of beauty. But that lofty climb, that ascent of the soul, began quite literally on a couch beside a beautiful boy.
The intimacy of the setting, the shared wine, the intellectual freedom made it possible to speak of the soul without embarrassment, to admit longing without shame, to explore the most profound aspects of human desire and connection in a way that formal settings simply couldn't allow. Chapter 6. The Wisdom of the Wine and the Wit of the Hetairai. Wine was not just a beverage at the symposium, it was the fuel, the compass, and the ultimate test. But the Greeks didn't drink the way we do today, guzzling unmixed spirits. To them, consuming wine without diluting it with water was considered the mark of a savage, a barbarian, someone utterly lacking in self-control. The ideal Greek drinker diluted his wine with at least 3 parts water to 1 part wine, sometimes even more. Why such caution? Because wine was not meant to overwhelm the senses or dull the mind. It was meant to loosen the tongue, to inspire eloquence, to encourage deep thought and witty banter, all without descending into senseless intoxication. The central Krater, that large ornate mixing vessel, sat in the middle of the room like a sacred altar, its contents dictating the very flow of the evening. The symposiarch, often elected for the evening, held immense power in deciding the crucial wine-to-water ratio. A strong mix meant a wild, uninhibited night, a plunge into Dionysian revelry. A weak one signaled a night of earnest poetry and profound discourse. It was a delicate balance, too, a tightrope walk between inspiration and idiocy. If the guests became too drunk, they might vomit on their neighbors' sandals, or worse, utter blasphemies that could earn them eternal shame.
Each guest was given a cup, often beautifully painted kylikes, and the mixed wine was ladled out in measured rounds. It flowed clockwise, a ritualistic progression, with each man taking a sip before passing it on. But it wasn't just about drinking. It was about rhythm, about the measured flow of conversation and contemplation. Each round came with a toast, a song, a witty remark, a challenge to a riddle. Wine, they believed, invited vulnerability, fostered creativity, and occasionally unleashed divine madness. The Greeks believed Dionysus, the god of wine, could inspire both profound divine insight and complete unhinged insanity, depending entirely on how much you poured and how quickly you consumed it. And pour they did, but not without purpose. There was a genuine art to pacing oneself, to maintaining one's composure and intellect. A truly respectable guest could drink several rounds, trade clever jabs, recite long passages from Homer, and still sit upright, his mind sharp, his wit intact. Losing control, becoming a drunken spectacle, that was for barbarians, for those who lacked the fundamental Greek virtue of self-control. In fact, the symposium was partly a training ground, a place where a real man could prove that he could enjoy pleasure, indulge in sensual delights, and still govern himself, still maintain his dignity. Self-control, even in the throes of intoxication, was a prized virtue. That said, not all guests adhered to the ideal, for human nature, then as now, was imperfect. The drunk who danced naked on the couches, who knocked over the lyre player, or who mistook the serving boy for a satyr, became the immediate subject of ridicule and cautionary tales for years to come. Stories of symposium disasters were passed around like juicy gossip, serving as potent warnings. But on the flip side, the slightly tipsy philosopher who spoke beautifully on the nature of justice or delivered a profound, heartfelt monologue on the true meaning of love might be remembered for eternity, his words immortalized by Plato himself. Not every moment at a symposium was dedicated to philosophical pondering. When the wine flowed freely and minds began to loosen, the Greeks frequently turned to games and music, deliberate, structured amusements that revealed a man's spirit, his cleverness, and his social finesse. The symposium wasn't just a place for intellectual showmanship, it was a vibrant playground for performance of all kinds. One of the most popular games was kotabos, a bizarre and surprisingly elegant pastime. Guests would flick the dregs of their wine at a target, often a small saucer balanced on a tall stand or floating precariously in a bowl of water, trying to knock it over with a well-aimed splash. Success wasn't just about skill, it was deeply symbolic. Men often called out the name of a lover while launching their wine, a cheeky blend of flirtation and athleticism. Hit the mark, and it meant the gods approved your passion, your desire was true. Miss? Well, perhaps you weren't worthy of her, or indeed of him. Music was an ever-present element. A hired flute girl, an autress, might play haunting tunes to accompany a toast or dance between courses, her body swaying in rhythm with the rising heat of the evening. Sometimes she danced herself, swirling gracefully, adding a visual component to the sensual atmosphere. But the guests didn't just listen, they performed. Reciting Homer, improvising erotic poetry, or singing spirited drinking songs was not optional. It was expected. A man who couldn't carry a tune or deliver a clever verse was silently judged, even pitied for his lack of refinement. But the real performance, the true test, was verbal. Witty banter, what they called sympathetic conversation, was a highly refined art form. Verbal duels tested memory, wordplay, philosophical knowledge, and, crucially, charm. Men would pose intricate medals, challenge each other to poetic improvisation, or tell biting, incisive jokes. It wasn't about cruelty, it was about finesse, about intellectual superiority delivered with a smile. The best conversationalist was quick-witted, thoughtful, and just slightly provocative, pushing the boundaries without causing genuine offense. And then there were the riddles themselves, sometimes deeply philosophical, sometimes surprisingly obscene. A well-timed riddle could silence a room, its guests pondering intently, or send it into raucous, uninhibited laughter. The most admired guests could deliver a dirty pun and a profound theory of justice in the same breath, a testament to their versatile minds. And if the room was just right, if the wine was perfectly balanced, and the company sharp and engaged, the entire event took on a magical atmosphere, half performance, half revelation. The ultimate goal of it all wasn't just to impress, to show off. It was to connect, to build bonds of friendship and intellectual camaraderie, to let personality, intellect, and desire intertwine in a fluid, exhilarating dance. In this playful chaos, reputations were made or destroyed. Because in the Greek symposium, you weren't just judged by what you thought, but by how cleverly and gracefully you could say it, all while half drunk and draped in a flimsy tunic. While Greek wives stayed firmly behind closed doors, barred from the intellectual and sensual world of the symposium, another kind of woman moved freely through the flickering lamplight. These were the Hetairai. These high-class courtesans were not mere entertainers or simple sex workers.
They were educated, witty, and meticulously trained in music, conversation, and the delicate art of seduction. Their presence was not just tolerated at the symposium, they were vital to its very essence, an indispensable part of the dynamic. While Greek wives stayed firmly behind closed doors, barred from the intellectual and sensual world of the symposium, another kind of woman moved freely through the flickering lamplight. These were the Hetairai. These high-class courtesans were not mere entertainers or simple sex workers. They were educated, witty, and meticulously trained in music, conversation, and the delicate art of seduction. Their presence was not just tolerated at the symposium, they were vital to its very essence, an indispensable part of the dynamic. A Hetairai could recite complex poetry, sing hauntingly alongside the lyre, debate intricate philosophical ideas with the sharpest minds, and outflirt even the cleverest aristocrat with a flick of her fan and a glance of her eyes. Unlike most Greek women, she was not confined to the household. She could own property, attend parties, and even accumulate significant wealth, often more than respectable wives. Some became legendary figures, like Aspasia, the famed partner of Pericles, who was rumored to have taught rhetoric to Athens' greatest minds, influencing the very core of their intellectual discourse. But make no mistake, their position was incredibly complex, a tightrope walk between celebration and scorn. Revered for their intellect and their undeniable charm, they were also objects of lust and the target of biting satire. Still, in the wine-soaked world of the symposium, the Hetairai was often the only woman who could speak freely and, crucially, be heard by men of influence. Their presence fundamentally changed the dynamic of the evening. With them, the gathering was no longer just a boys' club of philosophy and casual flirting. It became a charged, unpredictable dance of power, intellect, and performance. A well-placed, insightful remark from a Hetairai could instantly deflate a man's ego, or, conversely, spark a profound debate that lasted all night. They were conversational warriors, trained to challenge, to tease, and, on occasion, to subtly humiliate. Their wit as sharp as any philosopher's. Eroticism was always palpably in the air, a constant undercurrent, but it wasn't always physically consummated. The flirtation, the tension, the intellectual foreplay, that was often the primary point. Some Hetairai were indeed lovers, offering physical pleasure. Others remained more distant, using their allure and their sharp minds as leverage, playing by their own complex rules. They often used their beauty and wit not just for personal gain, but to climb socially or to subtly manipulate political alliances behind the scenes. For many men, these women represented a profound fantasy. Female companionship without the burdens of domestic duty, sensuality without the demands of obedience, intellect without the constraints of societal inhibition. They were free in a way that respectable Greek wives could never be, and that made them both intoxicating and, for some, dangerously alluring. In a room designed explicitly for male pleasure and intellectual pursuit, the Hetairai were a constant, elegant reminder that true control was never fully in male hands. They could ruin a joke with a single glance, redirect an entire debate with a well-timed question, or inspire a poem that would be remembered for generations. In a culture obsessed with power and performance, they were masters of both. Chapter 7, The Philosophical Crucible and the Unhinged Legacy. While the symposium had its fair share of games, flirtation, and poetic excess, its greatest, most enduring legacy may very well be intellectual.
Beneath the raucous laughter, the clinking of cups, and the rising intoxication, something truly remarkable often happened. Serious, profound thought took root. These were not mere drinking parties, despite their boisterous nature. They were laboratories of the mind, crucibles where ideas were forged and tested. Somewhere between the third cup of wine and the last challenging riddle, the guests often launched into debates that would shape Western philosophy for millennia to come. The most famous example, of course, is Plato's Symposium, a fictionalized yet deeply insightful account of a real gathering, where Socrates, Alcibiades, Aristophanes, and other luminous minds explored the fundamental nature of love itself. But this wasn't an isolated event. Across Greece, and especially in the vibrant intellectual hub of Athens, symposia were renowned as places where ideas collided, where concepts were sharpened against the whetstone of debate. Public issues, metaphysics, morality, and the very essence of human desire were all on the menu, served alongside the diluted wine. These debates weren't formal lectures delivered from a podium. They were passionate battles of logic, fierce contests of wit, and profound expressions of emotional conviction. The setting, as we've explored, mattered immensely. Wine lowered inhibitions and defenses. Humor softened the blows of intellectual sparring. And the intimate circular space gave explicit permission for vulnerability, for revealing one's true thoughts and feelings. You could challenge a man's view on justice, his belief in the gods, or even his most personal sexual preferences. And if you were clever and respectful enough, you could earn his lasting respect rather than his enmity. One of the central recurring themes was eros, erotic love, understood not just in the carnal sense, but as a profound philosophical force. Socrates, through Plato, famously described love as a ladder, a progression that starts with mere physical attraction, rises through the appreciation of worldly beauty, and culminates in the transcendent contemplation of the eternal form of beauty itself. That powerful, enduring idea, a cornerstone of Western thought, was born, quite literally, at a symposium. But other topics came up too, equally vital. What is true virtue? What truly makes a man wise? Can the soul be immortal? Is pleasure a good in itself, or merely a fleeting distraction? These were not abstract academic questions. They were urgent, personal, deeply relevant inquiries, delivered in between sips of spiced wine and bursts of laughter. It's no coincidence that many of the great thinkers of Greece, Socrates, Plato, Xenophon, frequented symposia. These events were intellectual incubators, hothouses of thought. They offered a rare combination: leisure, intellect, sensuality, and rigorous challenge. And unlike public forums, the symposium allowed for a nuanced, evolving discussion. You could speak freely, revise your opinions mid-sentence, or offer an idea still half-formed, testing its reception, and see where it led. For all their intellectual ambition and poetic charm, symposia could, and often did, spiral into chaos. While philosophers dreamed of universal truths and eternal beauty, reality had a persistent habit of barging in, wine-soaked and staggering. The symposium's tightrope walk between strict order and unrestrained indulgence didn't always end well. And when it failed spectacularly, often leaving a trail of embarrassment, scandal, and regret. Take Alcibiades, for example, the famously handsome, brilliant, and deeply scandalous Athenian statesman. He famously crashed the symposium depicted in Plato's dialogue, already gloriously drunk, crowned with ivy like Dionysius himself. Instead of offering a sober, reasoned reflection on love, he delivered a wildly personal and sexually charged speech about Socrates, his mentor and his object of desire.
It was funny, deeply emotional, and borderline inappropriate, blurring the line between admiration and desire. What was meant to be a noble, philosophical evening turned, in a moment, into an unfiltered outpouring of drunken obsession. But Alcibiades' antics weren't just awkward. They were, in a chilling way, prophetic. He would go on to betray Athens, flee to Sparta, switch sides yet again, and ultimately die in exile, his brilliant but reckless life mirroring the dark side of symposia culture. Charm without restraint, brilliance without ethics. And he wasn't alone. Many political scandals and personal disgraces had their roots in symposia. Gossip, amplified by wine, spread quickly. Who flirted too boldly? Who got too drunk?
Who insulted a powerful guest, or worse, blasphemed a god in the hazy afterglow of wine? It was all carefully noted, whispered, and later often weaponized. A single misstep in a private symposium could ruin a public career, a testament to the interconnectedness of private and public life in ancient Greece. Symposia also became increasingly associated with decadence, especially in later periods. As Athens declined and Rome rose to power, the original delicate balance of intellect and indulgence tilted dangerously toward pure hedonism. Wine was no longer watered down with such careful precision. Guests began to compete in gluttony and crude sexual boasts instead of eloquent poetry. The flute girls, once accompanists, now often outnumbered the philosophers, and what was once sacred play became cynical, self-serving performance. Even the Spartans, famously austere and disciplined, openly mocked Athenian symposia as soft, effeminate, and corrupt. To them, the very idea of reclining on couches, debating love while sipping diluted wine, seemed like a recipe for moral decay. And in some ways, it was. Yet the Greeks themselves were acutely aware of these risks. That's precisely why moderation, sophrosine, was so prized as a virtue. A man who could keep his dignity while drunk, who could charm without resorting to crude seduction, and who could argue passionately without humiliating his opponent, that was the true hero of the symposium. Long after the last Krater was emptied and the last lyre note faded into the Athenian might, the Greek symposium left behind something far more enduring than a hangover, a profound legacy of intellectual culture that continues to shape how we think, talk, and connect today. What began as a structured drinking party, a seemingly simple social gathering, became one of history's most unlikely engines of philosophy, art, and social development. The symposium offered a radical idea, especially for its time, that leisure wasn't merely idleness, a void to be filled. It was a sacred space. Schola, the Greek word for leisure, is the precise root of our modern word school. That, my friend, is no accident. The symposium literally turned leisure into a crucible for learning, a forge for ideas. It proved that wisdom didn't have to come solely from temples or formal classrooms. It could emerge organically amidst wine, laughter, flirtation, and flame-lit debate. Plato's symposium is the most famous relic of this world, and its impact is almost impossible to overstate. It gave us not just a model of structured philosophical dialogue, but enduring concepts like Platonic love, the very idea of the ladder of Eros, and the profound notion that beauty and truth are intimately, inextricably connected. The very format of that work, Men reclining, drinking, and riffing on a shared theme would become the prototype for everything from university seminars to the intellectual salons of the Enlightenment, and even perhaps to our modern late-night podcasts, where two minds drink, laugh, and dissect reality. The Romans inherited the symposium and transformed it into the convivium, a more lavish, less philosophical affair, but the underlying structure remained. Medieval and Renaissance thinkers, craving intellectual stimulation, reawakened the spirit of the symposium in their own salons, circles, and societies. And even today, in our seemingly chaotic modern world, we carry echoes of it. The dinner party that turns into a deep, meaningful conversation at midnight. The book club that spends more time grappling with existential questions than with the actual book. Even the symposium's flaws have left their mark. The gender exclusivity, the hierarchies of beauty and age, the inherent danger of excess, all remain relevant as cautionary tales in how communities are built and, sadly, broken.
But perhaps its greatest gift, its most timeless lesson, was the idea that pleasure and profound thinking need not be at odds, that beauty, desire, humor, and intellect could all share a single room, that truth could be seduced, not just reasoned. In the end, the Greek symposium wasn't just where philosophy met pleasure. It was where civilization discovered that the mind, the body, and the spirit all need a place to play. And in that sacred, wine-slicked space, the Western world truly learned how to talk. Good night, weary traveler. May your mind be filled with gentle thoughts, and your dreams be sweet and profound. Rest well.